All right, so we're going to talk about from perseverance to productive struggle, right? What we're looking at is what are the most, what are the behaviors we want to see from our students in our classroom? And this is actually a turn and talk moment, right? So for those of you who are teachers, talk about your students right now. If you aren't currently a teacher, talk about the teachers in the classrooms that you're supporting, or the students that you had in your classrooms when you were a teacher. But what we're looking at is, what are the behaviors we want to see in our students that you think is going to allow them to become successful in your classroom? So take a moment and turn and talk. What are some of those behaviors we want to see? All right, let's take a moment to think about this. So, I'm sure you came up with lots of things. I don't have the ability to pull from the audience and get it onto a slide. So I'm just going to start giving you some of the ones that I think you may have come up with. It'd be nice if they were curious. Do we agree on that? Right? If they were willing to take risks, that would be awesome. Yeah?
I'm interested in, when you say curiosity, we were just talking about that, how do you quantify curiosity or count it?
Great question. Resilience. It would be nice if we had students who are resilient. It's a very good question. That's the whole purpose of this talk. If they were engaged, right? Like that would be awesome, right? If they were patient with each other and with themselves. If they were willing to start, right? Like one of the things we actually found in our research was that there's a whole bunch of students who have what we call non-start behavior. They're not even willing to start. And if they're not going to start, they're sure as heck not going to finish, right? If they had perseverance, yeah, that'd be awesome. If they had a growth mindset, right? We're hitting a lot of these things, these words that have been sort of resonating in our field for the last 20 years or so. If they had empathy for each other, right? If they were interested in the math, that would be way better. If they were creative, if they had some creativity, right? If they were willing to make mistakes, right? Because we have this non-start behavior, but we also have what's called a quick stop behavior. And the quick stop behavior happens either when they get stuck or when they make a mistake and they just stop, right? They got to be willing to make mistakes. If they had some self-efficacy, this term I may want to define. Self-efficacy is their belief in their own abilities, right? And we know, like there's 20 years, no, I shouldn't say 20 years, there's 200 years of research on that shows that students with high self-efficacy perform better, right? If they were willing to engage in productive struggle, right? That would be awesome. If they had grit, if they were imaginative, if they had stick-with-itness, if they were collaborative. I don't know how many of these there are. I think that might be the last one. If they were good at collaboration, like this would be great, right? And what would be really nice if the kids came out of the package this way, right? Wouldn't it be amazing if they came into the classroom and they had all of these qualities, all of these behaviors, right? But they don't come out of the package this way, right? We're going to have to work on this. It would be nice, right? And I think we can all agree that if we had someone who was willing to start, had stick-with-itness, had perseverance, imagination, creativity, was engaged, was patient, was interested, had productive struggle and growth mindset, like just to name a few, you would have a kick-ass student, right? And if you had a whole class of students like this, we'd be through the curriculum by November, right? So I'm just going to talk about a couple of these in particular because they overlap strongly with some of my research interests. We can talk about all of them, of course, but I'm just going to dive into these ones to begin with. So I draw a lot on the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian psychologist out of the University of Chicago. He passed a few years ago, but about 35 years ago, he became interested in something he called the optimal experience. So the optimal experience is that experience where you are so engaged, you don't want to disengage, right? Which was like Rob trying to get your attention back earlier, right? Like, no, we're still going, right? And he actually stumbled into this area of interest through observing people engaged in hobbies, right? When people are engaged in a hobby, they are very engaged and they don't want to disengage. And he wanted to try to understand this phenomena. And so he studied people he thought would be most likely to have this. And he studied artists and musicians and athletes and scientists and mathematicians. And after he had captured enough of these optimal experiences among these people, he started to notice that there were common qualities to all of their experiences. Like, for one example was that time went quickly. They lost track of time, right? They became less self-conscious. They started engaging the activity for the sake of doing it rather than for the sake of being done, right? It was an end unto itself rather than a means to an end. And he noticed a whole bunch of these qualities, but he noticed, and he actually came up with 9 sort of qualities that were present in these optimal experiences. 6 of them, however, sort of are ways that we describe the experience, right? Like, I lose track of time. But 3 of them had to do with the environment that these optimal experiences happened in. And one of them was this idea that he noticed that every time there was an optimal experience, there was a perfect balance between the ability of the doer and the challenge of the task. And he put this on a graph, and he started by talking about this zone right here. High ability, low challenge. What are we going to experience there? Boredom. That's boredom, right? Then he looked at this zone up here. High challenge, low ability. That's frustration. And then he recognized that in order for people to have an optimal experience, they needed to be in this perfect balance point, which he then called flow. And he stopped talking about optimal experiences, and he wrote a bunch of books and made $1 million. And then his research went in a different direction. Okay? This is where my research comes in, because flow is really just another word for engagement, right? So engagement is this perfect balance between the challenge of the task and the ability of the learner. Okay, and we're gonna engage in some of that in the workshop this afternoon. One of the problems with this flow band is that students do this irritating thing called learning, which means that, you know, we find this perfect balance point and then they learn, and now we gotta do something to keep them in the flow band. Anyway, it turns out that there's some other zones here that my research showed, because it turns out that there's also perseverance and patience. So perseverance is the willingness to keep working even though there's an imbalance, even though the challenge exceeds their ability. And patience is the willingness to keep working even though their ability exceeds the challenge. And when we first start in classrooms, students have no perseverance and no patience, right? But once they develop these qualities, right, like if they have engagement, that's great. If they have perseverance and patience, they act as bumpers so that they're willing to keep working even though the balance isn't perfect. Kind of like, you know, when you go bowling with the little kids, you raise the bumpers on the side. So knowing this, we can now kind of define engagement as a balance between ability and challenge, right? That there is a balance. And we can define perseverance as a willingness to keep working when the challenge exceeds the ability. And we can define patience as a willingness to keep working when ability exceeds challenge, right? And this patience isn't just patience for themselves, it's also patience for others, right? So let's talk about some of the other ones here. So productive struggle is a process of grappling with a challenging task. Like, who's heard of productive struggle? Yeah, I'm going to come back to that one. We're going to talk some more about that one later, because there is a huge misunderstanding about productive struggle right now. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. I think we can all agree that students would collaborate better if they had empathy for each other, right? And it turns out, good news, kids have a tremendous capacity for empathy. It's hard to believe, especially if you work with teenagers, but it's true. One of the things that we have found, however, is that normative classrooms don't bring out empathy in students. In normative classrooms, there's really only room for two social emotional states. The first one is what I call the look at me crowd. Look at me, look how smart I am. Look how funny I am. Look how stylish I am, right? Look how I have the latest tech. Look at me, look at me, look at me. And for those of you who are classroom teachers, can you think of some students who are the look at me's right now? And then everybody else is that don't look at me. I want to get through this lesson with the least amount of social emotional damage possible, right? Well, what you have to understand about both look at me and don't look at me is that these are incredibly myopic states. They're entirely concerned with self, right? They got to start caring about each other. Okay, growth mindset is a belief that ability can be developed through effort. Okay, that's a very loosey-goosey definition. There's way more about that, but imagination and creativity. This one is kind of interesting to me because I actually wrote my PhD thesis on creativity. And one of the things that I had to do in order to grapple with creativity is I had to differentiate it from imagination. I've actually written encyclopedia entries on this. So imagination, so let's differentiate this. So I want all of you to close your eyes. And now I want you to imagine a world, another planet. It has a similar atmosphere to ours. Okay? I want you to imagine an animal that lives on that planet. So try to just conjure up an image of an animal that lives on that planet. All right, you can open your eyes. I'm guessing you had something like a six-legged lion or a striped giraffe or a dog that had two tails or something like that, right? Like you took something you already know from this world and you made a slight extension on it. Would you agree with that? Yeah, this is imagination. You were using your imagination, right? You're forming new ideas from existing ideas, right? Creativity is not the same thing. Creativity is where you form completely new ideas. They're actually a leap they're a leap or an illumination or an aha. Creativity is where you form an idea that isn't anchored in the previous ideas. And Henri Poincaré wrote about this, Jacques Hadamard wrote about this, and we can look backwards from our aha moment and see the logical connection, but that's not how we got there. It was a leap, it was an illumination, right? Which means that we can actually say to students, use your imagination, because you can willfully be imaginative. We cannot say to students, be creative. Creativity is an act that defies that sort of what John Dewey refers to as the logical norms. All right, let's talk about grit. It's a disposition to persevere, right? So perseverance we talked about earlier. Grit is that sort of disposition to be willing to persevere, right? Like they kind of come in ready to persevere. And I'm sure you could think of some students that have that quality. Self-efficacy we talked about is the beliefs in one's own ability. And this is all just a build-up to the one that's most important on this list, which is interest. Because interest has an access point that helps us see something different. You see, interest comes in two different types. This is where we tap into John Dewey again. John Dewey talked about the difference between situational interest and personal interest. These are different, right? So Eccles and Wigfield talk about situational interest as an emotional state aroused by specific features of an activity or a task. Whereas personal interest is a relatively stable evaluative orientation towards certain domains. I know, blah, 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 blah. Basically what it means is someone who has personal interest comes into the math classroom going, oh, this is awesome, I can't wait. Whereas someone who has situational interest kind of drags themselves in and goes, yeah, okay, let's see what you got. And then maybe you can hook them. You hook them with additive persistence or an interesting task, right? Like you hook them in some way, you get their interest going, They didn't come in that way. You got them to become interested. You see the difference? Right? And can you think of the students that you have taught that come into class already interested? But think about the students who you have managed to interest, right? And isn't that the work of teaching, right? Is to create that interest. Well, what we're really talking about here is what psychologists talk about as the difference between a state and a trait. So let me help you understand the difference here. So you know when you're hangry, right? That's a state. All I have to do is feed you, you'll be fine, right? But you know that uncle you have, doesn't like dogs, doesn't like kids, he's always complaining that everyone's driving too fast, he's just a grump, right? Everybody has a grumpy uncle. You know this, right? This is axiomatic. Everyone has a grumpy uncle. If you don't have a grumpy uncle, you are the grumpy uncle, right? Everyone has a grumpy uncle. That's a trait, right? So a state is this arousal in a specific activity. The situation has interested you, whereas a trait is something that is innate to you. You come in with it. We see the difference? All right, so let's go back to our list. Some of these are obvious. Like I will tell you this, grit, state or trait. That's a trait, right? It's a disposition towards. Perseverance is a state, right? The trait version of perseverance is grit. All right? So most of these in my world are states. They are states, right? And this is something that this is really what this talk is about. Which is about, and let's talk about productive struggle, for example. All right? Productive struggle is so easily misunderstood, right? It's great, isn't it? Isn't it awesome? All we have to do is challenge our students and they'll productively struggle. Right? No? If we challenge our students, what happens? They get frustrated, they give up, right? So what we have learned is that productive struggle is actually a state. Okay? What we found, so of course we have students who are more persistent than others, more gritty than others, but even the most persistent student will give up under the wrong circumstances, and even the most vulnerable student will persist under the right circumstances. So what are those circumstances? When students meet challenge on the heels of success, they are more likely to go into a state of productive struggle. If they meet challenge without success, prior success, they're more likely to give up. And this is why productive struggle is a state. I create the state of productive struggle by creating situations where the students can have success, challenge. And now they're more likely to go into a state of productive struggle. If we just assume that productive struggle is a trait, how's that working? Right? So what this means, and there's a very nice example of how we can actually create the state of productive struggle. This means that it's our responsibility. Right? And this is one of the things this is really what this talk is about this idea that it'd be nice if the kids came out of the package this way. They don't. And it would be nice if they could inhabit or inherit some of these traits. But ultimately, it's our responsibility as educators to actually create the states in which these behaviors manifest. So, what is the state of affairs in our math classroom? Right? What kinds of opportunities are we creating for students to experience these states? So you're going to talk about that. What are the things that you're doing in your classroom that actually are helping manifest these states, right? Or what are the things you're doing as a coach or as a leader to help teachers manifest these states in classrooms? And maybe what are some things we could do better? So talk about that, right? Willingness to start, willingness to make mistakes. You're humanizing yourself by showing your own fallibility, right? Willingness to take risks. They're starting to engage in this. All right, what else? Anybody else have something to share? Yes?
Establishing relevance, especially for like our middle and high school students.
Okay. Establishing relevance, like relevance to where this occurs in the real world. And so, why does this matter? Yeah, and what is that doing for them, do you think?
Giving them the willingness to start.
Yes, right? It gives them reality in a way. But I will push back on it a little bit. Like, it's really easy to establish relevance if you're teaching in the elementary curriculum. I would say that's a walk in the park. It's, slightly harder for middle school, but when you get up into secondary education, it gets really hard. Like, right? Circle trick, after the Ferris wheel, then what? Right? Like if you're willing to do blood splatters and forensics for conics, like you can do these sorts of things. But it's hard, like it's really hard because, and this has actually got to do with the way our curriculum evolved. And I'm just gonna take a little sidebar here, a little history lesson. So, for most of history, we did not have public education. Public education is a recent invention, last 160 years. Okay, prior to that, what we had were two forms of education. The first was the university. The university had a curriculum that was made up of the quadrivium and the trivium. The quadrivium was all math. So there was 7 courses that students studied at university. 4 of them were math. But that was back when they counted astrology as math and music as math, right? But that was the university curriculum. The other school was something called a reckoning school. So reckoning schools emerged in Italy originally with the emergence of the Hindu-Arabic system. When it came in through southern Italy, right, there was somebody who became really interested in it, somebody by the name of Leonardo da Pisa. Anybody know his other name? Fibonacci. So Fibonacci became absolutely fascinated with the Hindu-Arabic system because for the very first time, we had the ability to compute using the number system, whereas before we would compute using the abacus and we would record using the Roman numeral system. And this was a huge invention and an innovation that allowed them to create these reckoning schools where they would send, and reckoning schools were all about going and learning to become computers. Right? To learn to compute, to learn to compute, to learn to compute. And merchants would send their children to these schools to learn how to compute so that they can become calculators. That was their actual name when they graduated. Fast forward to the post-industrial revolution time when the developed world realized that if they wanted to remain economic powers, they would have to educate their citizens, so public education is born. And now we need a curriculum. So where did they find their curriculum? What they did was they went into the universities and they took the university math curriculum and they pulled it down like a Venetian blind. As far as they could. They got to about grade 8. Right? That's about as far as you could pull it. So where did they get their elementary curriculum? From the reckoning school. So that was why elementary was all arithmetic, calculation, and all of secondary was pre-calculus, basically. And this is why it's hard to establish relevance sometimes. Because the reason our curriculum often exists in high school is that the curriculum is grade 9 is to prepare you for grade 10. The grade 10 curriculum is to prepare you for, that's the relevance. And that's from time immemorial, right? So it's challenging, but we still try, right? But whew, it can be hard. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. And I know it's hard to accept the fact that this becomes a teacher responsibility. It would be nice if the teacher before us developed these states and then worked on it hard enough that the states actually became traits. Because this is actually one of the things we know, is that the persistence of a state will lead to a trait. okay? And good or bad, right? That grumpy uncle didn't come out as a grumpy uncle. He had continuous grumpy states that then just kind of calcified into a trait, right? So what we want is, we know that persistent state leads to traits, but we can't get traits unless we go through the state phase. So we have to actually start, as teachers, creating these states, to create the environments in which these states can emerge so that students have a chance to be creative, right? Creating an environment where they can become interested in something. To create an environment where they can start to have empathy for each other, where they're willing to start, where they become curious. So to your point, right? Curiosity is something that we can make a situation where students can become curious. But to actually measure how curious they are is difficult, right? But we need to create these traits. Now, I've been kind of chipping away at this for the last 20 years or so through building thinking classrooms, right? So I'm going to just show you a quick video. So this is a video of a thinking classroom. Some of you have seen this video. I will just show you a few things. I'll say a few things before this video plays. So number one, that's me. So this was shot post-COVID, so we're all masked up. These are 10th graders. Okay, so these are what, 15, 16-year-olds. All right, this was shot in Canada. This is not day one of them in a thinking classroom. They've been doing this for 5 weeks. I'm a guest instructor in the 6th week. This is Wednesday, in case you care. So they've had 5 full weeks of thinking classrooms, and now they're in their 6th week. There's going to be a bunch of people in the video who look like they're off task. Those are teachers. So we got teacher, 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 teacher. All right, so they're the ones who are milling about in the middle. The kids are the ones who are working at the whiteboards. All right, so we teach really fast in Canada. You need to work on it. So this is what a thinking classroom looks like. I think you can see just how much engagement there is, right? The kids are fully immersed, they're fully engaged. Lots of interaction, lots of collaboration within groups, but also between groups. Right? A lot of persistence, a lot of patience for each other. All right, so a few things about that video. That was 75 minutes. Okay? 75 minutes. All right? 75 minutes they were at the whiteboard. This school has no bells. Okay, this school has no bells, which means that at the 75-minute mark, I have to tell them it's time to go. You need to go. Go. Not going, not going, not going. All right? Yeah, he's going. Right? Is this normal teenage behavior? No. But this classroom created a state in which certain behaviors that we would like to see in our students started to emerge. I'm not claiming that these students are going to walk out of this room and now just exhibit that in their next classroom. What I'm claiming, though, is that within those walls, within that 75 minutes, we managed to create a state in which behaviors we don't normally see from students was manifested. Right? And with persistence, those kinds of states will turn into traits. And we know this because I've done research on that, but for the last 3 years, I've been gathering stories from teachers about their experiences building thinking classrooms. And I have this persistent survey running all the time. I got several hundred data points in this. And I just trolled through some of those stories recently. I just literally opened up 10 of them and just pulled out some quotes for this. Students are growing more in their willingness to try. Right? Do you see what's happening in that statement? Right? We're starting to see traitness come out. Right? I saw the clarity of their explanations dramatically improve. My students became better at not giving up and learning persistence, right? So we're creating states, but these states are becoming traits. One student said to me that she no longer freaked out if she didn't immediately know what to do. This is actually interesting. I want to find this study because I remember reading it when I first started my doctoral studies, but there was a study done in the late part of the last century where they surveyed college and university students who were taking math courses. And the question was, how long are you willing to work on a task before you give up? That was a question. Okay. The average, anyone want to guess what the average was? College and university math, students taking math courses. I'm not saying they're math major. 5 minutes? 2 minutes? 1 minute? Do I hear 50 seconds? All right, I hear 50 seconds over here, 40 seconds, 40. It was 10 seconds. That was the average. The average was 10 seconds, which means that students, by and large, were reporting that they would look at a task, and if they didn't immediately know what to do, they would stop, give up, right? Because in order to have a 10-second average, you got to have a lot of zeros, right? Students were far more able to persevere and not give up when faced with challenges. More risk-taking, knowing that it's okay to share their thinking in their way, right? Like we're seeing this transition from state to trait. And that's the payoff, right? They don't come out of the package this way, but maybe we can send them on to the next teacher with some of these traits. So how else can we do it? Well, there is a really strong temptation to lean into the standards of mathematical practice, right? Because this is what NCTM and sort of the US and Canada has been working on for about 30 years now, right? In some way, shape, or form. Recognizing that just focusing on content isn't getting the work done, right? Like, we're not creating the kinds of people that we want out of just focusing on content. And the way I look at this is that if we only focus on the nouns, which is the stuff the kids have to learn, we're not actually shaping behavior. We're going to have to pay attention to the verbs. And the verbs are those behaviors that we actually want students to do. So, and this comes across in so many different publications, right? From the NCTM process standards to the Common Core, to adding it up, which is just such an anchor. The 8 mathematical teaching and learning practices. In Canada, we have the 7 mathematical processes that we used for a long time. Where I live in British Columbia, we've now abandoned the processes and we've moved on to language of competencies versus content. So this is, by the way, just so you know, this is the grade 7 curriculum where I live. That's all of it. That's all of it. Right? And you'll notice that there is content. That's the list of content we have to teach. But here is the competencies. Right? And we used to have the stuff, all the verbs. These are the verbs. These are the nouns. We used to have all the verbs in the front matter of the curriculum document, which was really easy to ignore. And now you can't ignore it because they put them side by side. But I just want to raise a voice of caution here. Because when you dig into the standards for mathematical practice, when you dig into the processes or the competencies, and so on and so forth, if you look at these through the lens of state or trait, what you're going to notice is almost all of them are asking students to be something. Right? They're almost all written from the perspective of students will do, students will behave, students will be able to, and almost none of them are written from the perspective of what the teacher's supposed to do, right? Which means that we're actually coming at this from a trait perspective. And what happens when we come at it from a trait perspective is there is no room for actual growth in that model. Like, how do we actually grow a student who is better at communicating and representing? If all of our language around it is trait-based, there isn't actually a developmental arc. It's just sort of like, yeah, that's it. They either have it or they don't. And we're actually running into this within our own situation where teachers they're kind of, because we're actually having to evaluate students on this, and they're evaluating them on it, but they're not actually doing anything to improve it. Because the evaluation is all based on what the students should be able to do and not what the teachers are doing to create the situations for this to emerge. Right? So it isn't a huge leap to look at these documents through the lens of what the teacher needs to do to create the state. But the documents, by and large, are not doing that. It's sort of telling us what the students need, not what the teachers need to do. Does that make sense? So that's sort of a heavy lift. So I want you to just take a moment and process that. Turn and talk. I'll leave this up. Turn and talk about that, because that's sort of an uncomfortable statement. All right. So really, I think these documents are a great source of inspiration for us. And if we do read the front matter, and it talks about what the goals of education are and what it is we're trying to achieve, and it talks about the kinds of teaching that we need to do, it's all there, right? But when we think of them as standards for mathematical practice, often those practices are referring to the practices of the student. And what we really need to think about are the standards for mathematical teaching practices. Right? So what are the things we need to do? Because if we do these things, if we create the states, right? If we're creating the states consistently, persistently, ubiquitously, we're actually going to start to create convert some of those states into traits. Right? And then we're starting to achieve the ideas of the standards for mathematical practices, for student practices, right? But we can never achieve it if we start with a trait perspective. If we start with that the students have to have it, that it's innate, that it's embodied within them, as opposed to if we start from the perspective that it's embodied within our classroom. It lives in the verbs that are happening within our classroom. We can actually start to build these states, and we can start to create these traits. So I'm done. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, this QR code will get you there. You got to go through a login and so on. If you want to share your story with me and become some of the data points that is telling us how this works for you in your classroom, that QR code will do it. Other than that, I'm done.